They arrived one by one, shackled, hollow-eyed, and silent, stepping onto an island that did not just punish, they remembered. Every scar on their bodies twitched like it had a life of its own, replaying betrayals, thefts, and murders they thought long buried. One man tried to escape by rowboat, but the tide refused him, swallowing him inch by inch, leaving only a trembling shadow clinging to the jagged rocks. The survivors returned to the world carrying their sins in living flesh, scars that moved, judged, and whispered what no tongue could confess. What would you do if your body never forgave you, and the past was written on your very skin? The fog rolled heavier as the dawn approached, thickening into a gray wall that pressed against the jagged cliffs with the weight of a living thing. It moved in slow, deliberate waves, curling around the stones and seeping into every crack, carrying the sharp tang of salt and the unmistakable scent of decay. The earth itself seemed restless, quivering beneath the wind, as if remembering centuries of cruelty and abandonment. Along the shore, half-buried forms shivered in the mud, their flesh twitching as though some hidden memory stirred within them, a pulse of life that refused to yield entirely. The sea lapped cautiously at the edge of the island, hesitant to touch the jagged rocks, as though it feared awakening what had lain dormant for generations. No birds called, no creatures stirred. Only the wind whispered across the cliffs, shaping the air into a chorus of hushed lamentations that pressed against the ears and lungs alike. At the highest rise of the island, a wooden gate leaned precariously against its hinges, rotted and blackened by storms, yet stubbornly unyielding, a threshold marking the domain of the forgotten and damned. Beyond it, the colony sprawled like a wound in the earth, its structures skeletal and leaning, constructed from driftwood, stone, and the echoes of countless failures. Men and women appeared from the mist in silence, their chains dragging across the soil, eyes hollow yet burning with a strange, unspoken understanding. Their steps left impressions in the mud that seemed to linger, shifting minutely after they passed, as if the island itself read their sins and recorded them in the earth. The colony did not welcome them, it claimed them. Every gust of wind carried whispers, ancient and insistent, pressing against their ears with reminders of deeds thought long buried, sins thought erased by distance and time. The ground itself resisted, pulling at their legs and ankles, demanding confession through labor, through ritual, through suffering. They moved to the center of the colony, where the largest structure stood, blackened and scarred, walls warped and slick with moisture. It smelled of rot, salt, and the faint copper tang of old blood, an odor that clung to clothing and skin, sinking into every pore. Here, they began the work assigned to them, though there were no instructions written, no overseer present. Each task was a negotiation between body and conscience, each cut, scrape, and mark a word in a language older than speech. Flesh was both witness and scribe, scarred surfaces twitching with memory, recording deeds committed in shadows and dark rooms, crimes no tribunal had ever seen. The air vibrated with tension, a slow, oppressive rhythm that dictated movement and thought alike. Every twitch of muscle, every shiver of skin, every bead of sweat glistening in the fog-tinged light became a note in a symphony of punishment and penance. Shadows coiled beneath structures and around jagged rocks, thick and insistent, following the colonists with a patient intelligence, bending light in unnatural ways that made the land itself seem to pulse. The fog whispered promises and threats simultaneously, carrying the weight of all who had come before, embedding itself in bone and sinew. Time lost its measure here, folding in upon itself with every step and every breath, until the newcomers could no longer distinguish moments from eternity. And still, they pressed forward, shackles dragging, skin prickling, muscles straining, as if understanding that the island demanded not only their presence but their full surrender, that the sins of their bodies and minds were debts to be paid in flesh, in sweat, in the restless twitching of scars that had yet to reveal themselves. The gate behind them shuddered under the wind, yet did not fall, holding the secrets of all who had entered before, keeping the fog pressed close, and the colony waited, patient, eternal, and unyielding. They arrived slowly, one by one, emerging from the dense fog like ghosts summoned from another age, each body shackled, each eye hollow, yet flickering with a strange, internal flame that spoke of anticipation, fear, and unspoken understanding. The soil of the island clung to their feet, dark and wet, wrapping around ankles and calves as though the earth itself sought to claim them before they could even step into the colony. The air hung heavy with whispers, almost imperceptible at first, like the scratching of fingernails against stone, carrying fragments of forgotten deeds, sins committed in shadowed rooms, in alleys, in hearts hardened by time and necessity. It pressed into their lungs with every inhale, filling the chest with a cold heaviness that made breathing both necessary and agonizing. The island did not need to speak its demands. The newcomers felt them imprinted in the very ground, the very wind, the very air they breathed. Their arrival was not an act of mercy or imprisonment, it was a claim. The colony stretched across a series of jagged cliffs and flattened rocky terraces, buildings cobbled together from driftwood, salvaged timber, and stone, warped and blackened by wind and rain, leaning at impossible angles as if they, too, bore the weight of what had been done within. Inside these structures, the first task awaited. No instructions, no overseers, only the tools that had been left, sharp and unyielding, their surfaces gleaming faintly in the dim light filtered through cracks in walls and ceilings. The men and women did not hesitate. Hesitation was a luxury the island did not allow. Each movement became ritualized almost immediately, instinctive. Hands found blades and branding irons as though they had always known their purpose. Flesh became both the instrument and the ledger, each cut, burn, and incision a word in a language older than speech, a narrative written in pain, in the trembling of nerves, in the contraction of muscles unwilling to obey the will of the mind. Wounds opened and closed in impossible rhythms, deepening with each touch, yet never healing, as though the body itself remembered and demanded repetition. The scars writhed beneath the skin, subtle at first, tiny tremors that could be mistaken for spasms or nerves, but with every hour, every day, they grew more deliberate, moving across muscle and sinew, tracing the outline of sins committed long before arrival. Theft, betrayal, murder, false witness, cruelty to kin and stranger alike, they all emerged in raised lines that twisted beneath the surface, whispering through pain and twitching, demanding acknowledgement. Nights were relentless. Shadows stretched unnaturally across floors and walls, merging with forms of those who moved in the candlelight, their elongated shapes twisting, sometimes separating, sometimes curling around the bodies like coiling serpents. Figures that had vanished during the day returned with dusk, slipping silently from the mists, moving in impossible arcs, retracing steps the colony had forgotten, but the island remembered. Their motions mimicked crimes once committed, gestures of cruelty or cowardice repeated with exacting precision, as if each scar, each twitching mark on the skin, had rehearsed the movements in secret, outside the mind, in the private theater of flesh. The newcomers understood instinctively that these were not phantoms of the mind, but echoes of acts remembered by sinew, tendon, and muscle, a language older than law or morality. To resist, even in thought, was to invite pain beyond comprehension, for the island did not merely punish the body. It spoke through it, shaping limbs and flesh into instruments of confession, weaving sin into scars that moved with a life of their own. Days and nights bled into one another. Hunger and exhaustion pressed at the edges of consciousness, yet the labor never slackened. Each mark left on flesh demanded another. Each twitch beneath the skin echoed in the actions above, creating a rhythm of pain and memory that governed thought and motion. The faintest hesitation, an unsteady hand, a flicker of doubt, was met with immediate retribution. Scars surged beneath the surface, pulling the muscles in impossible ways, forcing the spine to arch, the hands to tremble, the eyes to roll, as if recalling acts long buried in the mind. The newcomers learned quickly that control was an illusion. The flesh remembered more than they could, would, or should ever remember. Some succumbed to despair, moving mechanically, eyes fixed on the ground, their breath shallow and ragged, as scars pulsed beneath, tracing histories they had never dared recount aloud. Others embraced the rhythm, letting the pain guide them, letting the scars dictate motion, carving, branding, cutting, burning in the relentless pursuit of an absolution the island alone could grant. The colony itself became alive under the rhythm of the inhabitants. Wind-driven shadows coiled through structures, shifting light into unnatural forms, hands and faces stretching across walls, merging with twitching scars in impossible alignments. Rainwater pooled in depressions along floors and terraces, reflecting movements that did not correspond to any living body, as if the sins of the past had learned to enact themselves independently, mocking the newcomers' belief in autonomy. Every sound, the scraping of metal, the wet slide of flesh, the hiss of heated iron, the quiet exhalation of labored breath, became amplified, forming a symphony in which guilt and penitence were inseparable, each note a reminder that the island was not merely a place, but a presence, patient and eternal. Some tried to speak, muttering pleas or prayers, but words dissolved before they left the lips, absorbed into the air and fog, carried to the cliffs where the wind twisted them into unintelligible whispers. Even thought itself became dangerous, for the mind could be read, not by eyes, but by the tendrils of memory embedded in skin and muscle, and doubts or denials triggered spasms that pulled bodies into unnatural contortions, leaving scars to trace sins with ruthless precision. By the end of what could have been a single day, or a year, or a decade, the newcomers had learned that the island did not demand repentance, but understanding, that the body itself could remember, that guilt was etched into flesh, and that freedom, if it ever came, would be meaningless without acknowledgement of the scars that refused to lie still. The fog thickened again at the approach of evening, carrying the scent of salt, rot, and copper, pressing closer to the colony, obscuring forms, swallowing structures in gray obscurity. Figures moved within it, silent and deliberate, scars twitching beneath the skin, tracing histories older than the living remembered. The island exhaled around them, patient and eternal, claiming each soul with invisible fingers, pressing the body into rituals older than any law, any creed, any hope. Shackled and silent, the newcomers pressed on, aware that their labor was endless, their sins visible not only in thought but in sinew, and that the scars themselves were watching, waiting, patient as the stones and fog, relentless as memory itself. Time dissolved on the island, stretching and folding into a viscous, unmeasurable flow, where days bled into nights and nights into a shadowed eternity. Weeks passed, though the newcomers no longer counted them, for the air, thick with mist and salt, carried no markers of sun or moon, and the wind whispered only of transgression and remembrance. Each step across the jagged cliffs, each laborious movement through the uneven terraces became part of a rhythm older than any human understanding, a cadence dictated by the scars themselves, twitching and shifting beneath the skin. Some learned this rhythm with mechanical precision, hands moving as if guided by invisible currents, cutting and carving, branding and slicing, each gesture a note in the island's relentless symphony of punishment. The scars pulsed beneath muscles and sinews, small tremors at first, almost imperceptible, then deliberate, tracing paths of thefts, betrayals, murders, and secret cruelties so profound that the body itself refused to forget. Every twitch of the flesh was a confession, every raised line a syllable of sin whispered through pain, a language older than words, older than law, older than memory itself. Occasionally, a new arrival appeared, silent and hollow-eyed, their shackles dragging across stones slick with rain and blood. They stepped into the colony as if crossing a threshold into another world, where freedom had no purchase and the earth itself insisted upon recognition of past wrongs. Within hours, the first screams would tear through the mist, raw and violent, echoing off cliffs and structures, carrying across terraces and reaching those who had become accustomed to the rhythm of their torment. Others would gather, eyes wide, hands trembling, watching as the transgressions of the newcomer traced themselves in living lines upon skin, winding and coiling over chest and stomach, across shoulders and back, marking offenses committed long ago, crimes that had been buried beneath time, only to surface in relentless, physical insistence. Fingers pressed against twitching scars could feel the faint thrum of memory, the heartbeat of deeds that refused to remain hidden, and no cry, no plea, no act of denial could halt the movement. The colony itself had become a living manuscript, a grotesque tapestry of guilt in which each body contributed a line, a paragraph, a chapter of suffering. Paths of scars intertwined, overlapping in impossible combinations, creating mosaics of betrayal, theft, and bloodshed that no human eye could fully decipher. Those who had been longest on the island moved with a strange grace, understanding instinctively the choreography imposed by the land, letting pain and twitching flesh guide their hands and bodies with a precision that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. They carved and branded, not out of cruelty nor devotion, but from obedience to the rhythm of the scars, which dictated movement with a language beyond comprehension, a cruel and inexorable logic written in sinew and muscle. Even sleep, when it came, was invaded by the same cadence. In dreams, the scars twisted and writhed, muscles arched, limbs pulled into shapes that recalled transgressions committed in years past, nightmares merging seamlessly with waking hours. The wind moved differently here, heavy with salt and copper and the faint, acrid scent of old blood. It pressed into the lungs, filling the chest with an awareness of guilt, of exposure, of acts done and remembered by the flesh itself. Rainwater ran across terraces and into hollowed stones, pooling in grotesque mirrors where the twitching of scars reflected the movement of sins. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, wrapping themselves around bodies, coiling beneath walls and floors, sometimes separating into shapes that seemed semi-autonomous, echoing gestures performed by hands and limbs long before the arrival of any observer. These shadows moved with deliberate intent, as if reading the scars beneath the skin, anticipating the twitch of a muscle, the arch of a back, the compression of chest in a scream yet to come. Silence was never complete. It vibrated in the air, punctuated by the hiss of wet iron, the scrape of blades, the quiet convulsions of flesh recalling crimes remembered only by sinew and skin. Some sought to resist. They struggled against the rhythm, attempting to step aside, to slow their labor, to deny the revelations written upon their bodies. The response was immediate, subtle at first, a muscle pulled too sharply, a hand contorting involuntarily, a scar rising beneath the skin as if to trace the act of resistance itself. Pain became not punishment but a language, a constant dialogue between body and island, between memory and flesh, a conversation in which denial was impossible. Slowly, resistance gave way to compliance, then to something darker, a meditative acceptance, a surrender not of the mind but of the body, letting scars dictate movement, letting twitching sinews lead the hands, shaping the flesh into instruments of confession. Their labor became art and atrocity intertwined, a choreography of suffering that persisted through days without distinction, marked only by the subtle shifts of scars beneath the surface, by the soft exhalation of wind through terraces, by the faint, metallic tang of copper that seemed to seep from skin itself. The island claimed more than labor, it claimed thought. Memories, buried and carefully hidden, surfaced in the patterns of scars, pressing into consciousness with the force of inevitability. Men and women who had come seeking penance, or punishment, or merely survival found themselves trapped in the living ledger of their own making. Every twitch of a scar told a story, every arch of muscle a confession, every involuntary spasm a reminder that the body remembers what the mind wishes to forget. There was no mercy here, no reprieve, only the patient, omniscient presence of the island pressing the flesh into service, demanding acknowledgement, shaping every sinew into a narrative written in pain and permanence. By the end of what might have been a month, a year, a decade, the colony had transformed into a theater of living memory. Each body was both actor and audience, each scar a line in a story too vast to comprehend, a history of sin and revelation writ across sinew and skin. The newcomers had learned the unspoken truth. Time on this island was meaningless, resistance was folly, and the flesh, once claimed, would remember forever. And so they moved, cut, carved, branded, each twitch beneath the skin guiding the next gesture, each exhalation syncing with the rhythm of scars that writhed and pulsed with memory, until the island itself seemed to breathe with the lives it had claimed, patient, eternal, and unforgiving. Hunger gnawed at them in a rhythm that matched the pulsing of their scars, cold wrapping around their limbs like iron chains, yet neither sensation brought despair. They welcomed the ache, mistaking it for a cleansing, a penance carried out by the island itself. Nights were the harshest teachers, when the wind tore across jagged cliffs and through hollowed terraces, carrying voices that no mouth had formed, whispering histories of violence, deceit, and sorrow as if the earth mourned every act committed upon it. Each gust threaded itself through the colony, bending hair against the face, pressing into the ears, and bringing with it the scent of salt, rot, and copper, as though the memories of long-dead souls had soaked into the stones and timber, now rising to mark the living. No words were needed to understand these messages. The body felt them. Muscles clenched, limbs trembled, hearts skipped in cadence with tales older than any memory the newcomers had carried when first they arrived. Shadows moved across walls and floors with a will of their own, stretching and coiling like living serpents, at times separating into grotesque humanoid forms that mimicked acts long ago committed, acts the flesh now refused to forget. The earliest arrivals, those who had endured longest in the relentless embrace of the island, became something between observer and instrument. Their oldest scars shifted beneath skin, intertwining and converging across bodies as if plotting maps of sins too complex for comprehension. Hands that had once stolen, struck, or killed now moved with compulsive care, performing gestures of their crimes repeatedly, over and over, as though the body itself insisted upon recounting each offense in precise motion. It was not conscious action but obedience, a dance dictated by sinew and tendon, by twitching scars that pulsed in rhythm with unspoken memory. Even thoughts bent to the cadence of flesh, desire and fear subordinated to the instructions traced beneath skin, shaping every movement, every breath, every subtle tension of limb. To resist was impossible. Every attempt met with instantaneous reprisal, muscles contracting in unnatural ways, scars rising to trace the denial itself, limbs contorting into shapes that spoke of confession and submission. The colony itself seemed to pulse under this choreography of memory and flesh. Terraces soaked with rain and sweat became mirrors of the past, reflecting twitching scars in distorted light, echoing the movements of hands that had already danced the same macabre ritual 1,000 times. Doors warped with age creaked in alignment with muscle and sinew, floorboards flexed beneath feet as if responding to invisible rhythms, walls exhaled with the stories absorbed into their stones. The air carried the metallic tang of copper and iron, of sweat and blood, intertwining with the scent of decay, creating a perfume that saturated lungs and thought alike, pressing the mind into a state where guilt and labor were inseparable, and where the distinction between body and island, action and memory, had ceased to exist. New arrivals, still fresh with the naivety of expectation, entered this world like swimmers into a tidal whirlpool, immediately claimed by the rhythm and the scars. Screams erupted without warning as the first contact between skin and memory occurred, voices torn from throats by convulsions and twisting sinew. Limbs moved against will, muscles contracting in obedience to the histories etched beneath them, following paths laid centuries ago by hands long dead, now remembered in the flesh of the living. Some fell to the ground, clutching chest or stomach as scars writhed beneath, tracing sins thought buried forever. Others moved instinctively, guided by the twitching maps of pain, carving, branding, marking themselves and each other with gestures dictated not by conscience, but by sinew. The labor was endless, Yet the pain became rhythm, and rhythm became labor, until distinction between suffering and purpose vanished entirely. Within these hours and days that blurred into one another, hunger and cold persisted as constant companions, gnawing and pressing, yet they became part of the meditation, part of the island's instruction. Pain was no longer mere sensation, it was meaning. The oldest scars, pulsing across chests, backs, arms, and faces, began to form intricate, overlapping webs, grotesque maps that no eye could fully read, a cartography of human cruelty inscribed upon living flesh. These maps, however, were alive, moving beneath skin, stretching and coiling, altering shape with each tremor and breath, recounting every theft, betrayal, murder, and act of cruelty committed, not only by the living but by all who had walked the island before. Muscle and tendon became letters in a language older than law, older than speech, older than conscience, spelling out guilt with a precision the mind could scarcely follow, each twitch a syllable, each convulsion a word. The air between terraces and structures shivered with intent. Shadows no longer merely mimicked forms. They became actors, echoing gestures of cruelty, betrayal, and murder, sometimes coiling around limbs and torsos as if guiding them, sometimes separating into figures of impossible geometry, as if the island itself had become a choreographer, manipulating sinew, scar, and shadow simultaneously. Every footstep on stone, every scrape of a hand along timber, every exhalation was in dialogue with these spectral guides, who moved with perfect, terrifying precision. Even thought could not escape the rhythm. Internal resistance provoked immediate reprisal. Muscles arched, tendons tightened, scars writhed violently, forcing confession through contortion, and forcing each new arrival to surrender to the choreography the island demanded. By the end of what might have been a week, a month, a year, the colony had become a single organism, a living testament to its own history. Each individual body contributed to the larger pattern, an overlapping, writhing tapestry of scars, movements, shadows, and labor, in which guilt and punishment, memory and motion, were inseparable. Pain was no longer merely experienced. It was understood, anticipated, orchestrated, performed, and repeated in synchrony with every muscle, every sinew, every twitch of skin beneath which the scars pulsed like hidden, living text. The island breathed in rhythm with them, exhaled across cliffs and terraces, pressed into flesh, and filled the air with the eternal insistence of acknowledgement. There was no mercy here, no hope of reprieve, only the patient, unyielding teaching of hunger, cold, shadow, and scar, until the body itself had learned to remember, and the mind, finally, became redundant. And so the colony moved and labored in endless cycles, each action dictated by twitching flesh, each thought bent to the rhythm of scars, each breath synchronized with the whispered histories carried across cliffs by wind and fog. Hunger, cold, and pain became meditation. Scars became scripture. Shadows became teachers. The island had claimed them, not merely as bodies or souls, but as instruments, vessels through which memory of all sins would persist eternally. Hands moved, muscles arched, scars pulsed, and the wind whispered, and the living mosaic of guilt continued, patient, eternal, and unforgiving. The first escape attempt ended before the sun had fully risen, leaving a silence heavier than any storm. One man, gaunt from hunger and shivering with cold, had slipped into a rowboat, hands raw against the splintered wood, heart pounding with the fragile hope of freedom. The mist clung to the water like a living veil, swirling in pale, ghostly tendrils, carrying the faint, metallic scent of the island's own blood. He pushed against the tide, but the water seemed to thicken, each stroke heavier than the last, dragging him back toward the cliffs that had watched centuries of transgression. His muscles burned, his lungs fought for air, yet the island did not release him. As the first light of morning touched the jagged stones, the water rose with a deliberate slowness, wrapping around his legs, his waist, his chest, swallowing him inch by inch. His screams echoed across the terraces and hollows, torn and ragged, but the wind carried them only to those who had stayed, as if to warn, to imprint in their memory the futility of defiance. When the tide finally receded, only a trembling shadow clung to the jagged rocks, blackened and quivering, a distorted silhouette of the man who had sought escape, and the colony understood at last that the island enforced its justice itself, patient, deliberate, and inexorable. Those who remained watched in quiet horror. None spoke, none dared move too quickly, for the scars beneath their skin twitched in response, reading fear, calculating resistance, shifting in warning. Every new attempt to flee or resist had consequences just as immediate and grotesque. Days later, the bodies of the few who had tried were found, contorted into positions impossible for living muscle, torsos twisted, limbs bent backward, heads tilted at angles no human neck could sustain. The scars had rewritten themselves, carving fresh maps upon flesh, tracing both crime and punishment in raised, convulsing lines. A finger that had struck, a hand that had stolen, a foot that had faltered in betrayal. The island remembered all, translating each act into the living language of sinew and scar. Those who dared to touch the bodies could feel the subtle pulsing beneath skin, the faint thrumming of memory as it shifted and writhed like a creature of its own making. Silence fell over the colony in the wake of these discoveries, a silence thick with dread and understanding. The rhythm of the island was absolute. Obedience was no longer a choice, but survival. Some, after weeks of this revelation, began to submit fully, letting the rhythm of scars dictate their movements, letting their hands, muscles, and limbs become instruments of confession without the need for conscious thought. They moved together in an unspoken choreography, each gesture guided by twitching flesh, each incision and brand and carved line a response to the island's unyielding demand. Pain and labor became indistinguishable, sensation and obedience inseparable, until even the thought of resistance seemed impossible. Yet even in their surrender, the scars continued to pulse, rewriting themselves in subtle, cruel variations, ensuring that no memory, no sin, no betrayal could be truly forgotten. Every heartbeat became a reminder that the island remembered more than they ever had, more than any mind could contain. The very walls and terraces seemed to absorb this rhythm, vibrating with it, echoing it, feeding it back into flesh and scar. Those who had tried to flee were never spoken of by name. Their presence lingered in the twitching of sinew, the arching of shoulders, the subtle convulsions that moved through the colony at moments of pause or contemplation. Shadows lengthened over stone and wood, elongating the bodies of the living, imitating the grotesque positions of those who had perished in defiance, a constant, silent reminder of the consequences. The air carried the mingled scents of salt, blood, and sweat, heavy and almost suffocating, pressing into lungs and consciousness alike, forcing attention onto the rhythm that now governed all. The mist rolled over terraces and cliffs, wrapping the colony in a soft, oppressive embrace, as if the island itself were breathing across their shoulders, measuring each twitch and contraction with infinite patience. Even those who had once resisted the rituals, who had fought against the carvings, branding, and twisted choreography, found their bodies betraying them. Limbs contorted at night into positions dictated by scars that pulsed beneath the skin, faces pressed into palms as sinew writhed in recollection of theft, betrayal, violence, and murder. Attempts to sleep were interrupted by the involuntary flexing of muscle, the crawling of raised lines, the faint, persistent thrum of history beneath flesh. Hunger and cold, once sensations that might have been ignored or endured, became instruments of obedience. Each pang, each shiver pressed the body further into alignment with the island's rhythm. They learned, without words, that surrender did not bring comfort, that acceptance was not relief, but that denial invited more precise cruelty, deeper inscriptions of memory upon the living canvas of skin. Over time, the colony became something other than a collection of bodies. It became a living testament, a single organism of twitching flesh, scars, shadows, and labor. The rhythm of memory pulsed through each individual, through the terraces, through the air itself. Every motion was dictated by the choreography of scars, every breath synchronized with the invisible language of sinew, every heartbeat a metronome marking obedience and acknowledgement. Resistance existed only as a memory, punishment eternal, inscribed into the very fabric of the island. Those who moved in perfect alignment with this rhythm became conduits of history, carrying the acts of all who had ever suffered there, their own sins amplified and intertwined with those of predecessors. The water lapped against cliffs, carrying no mercy, and the wind whispered over terraces, insistent and omniscient, reminding all who remained that the island's justice was neither arbitrary nor forgiving. And so the colony endured, bodies twitching, scars pulsing, labor performed without pause, every breath a negotiation with pain, memory, and inevitability. The first escape had failed, and in failure, the rhythm had been established, absolute and eternal. Every heartbeat, every muscle contraction, every twitch of skin beneath which scars writhed, carried the unspoken truth. The island remembered all, enforced all, and those who lived within it could never forget, could never escape, could never be free. The tide would continue to rise and swallow those who dared defy it. Shadows would continue to twist over stone and wood. Scars would continue to writhe with unrelenting memory, and the colony would move in unbroken, obedient cadence, patient, eternal, and unforgiving. The first ships approached the mist-shrouded harbor as if the sea itself hesitated, reluctant to deliver the survivors back to a world that no longer seemed their own. The air smelled faintly of brine and smoke, but beneath it lingered a subtle, metallic tang, the hidden scent of what the island had left upon them. They disembarked slowly, legs unsteady, shoulders hunched beneath invisible burdens, eyes scanning the horizon as though expecting the cliffs and terraces to rise again and claim them before they could step onto solid ground. Their skin bore the history of countless sins, mapped and raised, twitching scars that moved with a life independent of thought, each curve and line spelling acts of theft, betrayal, murder, and lust in a language written only in flesh. Hands flexed and fingers curled, muscles twitching in patterns that repeated the gestures they had performed under the island's relentless gaze. Every heartbeat was a drum of memory, each step a reminder that freedom was an illusion, that the past had not only followed them but had inhabited them, rendering them walking archives of guilt. No one dared speak of the island aloud. Language seemed insufficient, too crude to convey the full magnitude of what had been endured. Even the survivors' own reflections betrayed them, eyes catching the faint, subtle pulses beneath the skin, watching lines and ridges shift as if negotiating with some unseen arbiter. They tried to wash themselves, to scrub the skin with sand and soap, to drown the motion beneath water and fire, but the scars laughed at such attempts, twitching with deliberate, cruel persistence. Some rose in the dead of night, muscles arching their torsos into grotesque positions, fingers splayed in gestures of accusation, while others carried an invisible weight in their gait, their shoulders pulled tight, back bent by the insistence of history pressing through flesh. The body had become both prisoner and witness, holding truths that no confession, no tribunal, no mercy could erase. As the survivors traveled through towns, they noticed the reactions of others before any words were spoken. Children shrank from them in instinctive revulsion, adults whispered in corridors, and strangers' eyes lingered too long on twitching hands, as if sensing the restless judgment embedded in every line of sinew. No matter what stories they told, what lies they wove to cover the truth, the flesh contradicted them, replaying the choreography of sins with a precision that defied concealment. Each scar was a litany, a memory rehearsed continuously, demanding acknowledgement, insisting that no observer, no authority, no God, would let the past remain unseen. Even intimacy became a perilous act, for flesh that remembered betrayal refused to obey desire or consent. It reacted only to the rhythm of memory, twitching, curling, arching in ways that no lover could predict or control. Time passed, yet the island's influence did not fade. Survivors aged, bodies weakened, But the scars remained, ceaselessly active, as if the very marrow of their bones had absorbed the law of the cliffs and terraces. Pain was no longer the dominant language. It was anticipation, subtle and inexorable, the quiet assertion that every act, every thought, every lapse in conscience would be recounted by muscles, tendons, and skin. In mirrors, they saw shadows of their former selves. At night, they dreamed in a rhythm not their own, moving in silent, repetitive gestures of sins long committed. Some tried to warn others, writing letters or speaking in hushed tones, yet no testimony could convey the relentless precision of flesh as it judged, punished, and reminded. Even priests recoiled, sensing a presence older and more patient than any doctrine, a sentient reckoning etched in sinew that could not be exorcised, prayed away, or ignored. The world continued to turn, indifferent and ignorant of the law carried in human skin. Wars were fought, cities burned, empires rose and fell, yet the survivors walked among it all, invisible carriers of a truth too grotesque to name. Some attempted to end their lives, seeking release from the relentless pulses beneath their skin, but the scars endured, their memory unyielding, twisting muscles and sinew with a mockery of mortal finality. Death itself was no liberation, for when bodies were examined posthumously, the lines persisted, twitching faintly in cold rigor, as if the island's judgment was a resonance impossible to erase. Over decades, the legend of the survivors grew in whispers, a story told in fear and awe, but always incomplete, always partial. Those who encountered them often found themselves unnerved by the subtle twitch of a hand, the arch of a back, the tiny ripple beneath skin that seemed to indicate a history they could not comprehend. Artists tried to capture it, scientists attempted to measure it, and scholars debated it, yet none could fully contain the reality. The island had inscribed justice not upon memory, not upon conscience, but upon the body itself, creating witnesses who could not lie, sin that could not be concealed, guilt that could not be forgotten. In the end, the survivors aged into a living testament of inevitability, their bodies both monument and warning. Even in towns far from the northern cliffs, the subtle twitch of muscle, the rise of a scar, the arching of a torso carried the presence of the island, a relentless, invisible jury that could not be bribed, ignored, or escaped. And when the last of them passed, the scars did not vanish. Traces persisted, faint but undeniable, echoing the deeds they had chronicled, leaving the world to reckon with sins that had been made visible, intimate, and eternal. The island itself faded from maps and memory, but its law endured, carried in sinew and skin, a judgment more patient, more precise, and more unforgiving than any human tribunal, and the world learned, too late, that some sins cannot be hidden, cannot be buried, cannot ever be forgiven.